Hey, good evening. My name is Lynn Knoll. I am co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Just the Facts on the Constitutional Amendment for Reproductive Rights. As you know, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. Part of our purpose is to educate voters. That, in fact, is the purpose of this particular webinar. This is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland Shaker Heights chapter, and League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland through Cleveland Heights chapter. I want to emphasize a couple of points. The League of Women Voters has had a long history of standing for reproductive rights. The first position, calling for choice, was approved at the 1983 League of Women Voters U.S. Convention. Since then, that position has been affirmed in many ways, recognizing that reproductive justice is about women's equality, dignity, and basic health care. As an ally of reproductive rights organizations, we know that safe access to health care, including abortion, is essential to our democracy. The League of Women Voters will continue to stand in solidarity with all who fight to protect reproductive freedom. I would like to introduce the moderator of this webinar as well, and that is Annette Sutherland. She is chapter chairperson of the Shaker chapter. Annette, you're on.
Good evening. This evening, the League will talk to our guest for around 30 minutes about the proposed amendment to the Ohio Constitution concerning reproductive choice. Then we will turn to questions from our audience from all over the state. Those of you watching, please post your questions with the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And remember, the League of Women Voters events are a space for civil discussion and information, not for debate. Our expert guest speaker, Lauren Beene, MD, is a general pediatrician practicing in the Cleveland area. Dr. Beene earned her medical degree from Case Western University, a master's in biology from Oakland University, and a bachelor's degree from Cornell University. When the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade last June, and Ohio immediately enacted a ban on abortions after a patient's 6th week of pregnancy, Dr. Beene and another physician turned to social media to find like-minded medical professionals. They founded Ohio Physicians for Reproductive Rights and wrote a letter about the negative impact of the law upon their patients, seeking repeal of the new abortion restrictions in Ohio. Within 3 days, the group had gathered more than 700 signatures from a gamut of medical specialties. Within 5 days, more than 1,000 signatures. The group has since grown to about 1,200 Ohio physicians. The July 2022 letter was published by news organizations. It speaks of the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship and the need for proactive medical care. The letter predicted a disproportionate impact on more vulnerable and underprivileged patients. Lauren, what is the intent of the proposed amendment?
So the intent, and hello everybody, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. The intent of the amendment is to establish a fundamental right to reproductive freedom for the people of Ohio. And so our goal is to have this enshrined into the Constitution as being a basis for pretty much all other decisions relating to reproductive health care to reference to, specifically that the people of Ohio have a right to their own, make their own reproductive health care decisions.
What medical expertise went into drafting these words?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It was a very long process. So I was involved in writing this amendment, as were numerous other people in the state, including other physicians, including OBGYNs, OBGYN leaders in the state, and abortion providers, as well as legal experts, constitutional law experts, And we also, this amendment was really drafted based on the language of the amendment that was passed in Michigan. And so we weren't reinventing the wheel. And when we started with a text of an amendment, which was basically what they had done in Michigan, we were able to see, okay, based on, how the people responded to different aspects of language of that text of the Michigan amendment, and we could kind of craft ours to make sure that it was sort of not going to be as controversial in some areas, be as straightforward as possible, and be something that the people could relate to. There was a lot of polling data that came from the Michigan amendment that we were actually able to use as well when we were thinking about how to construct the Ohio amendment. So there was a huge team of experts, and I don't consider myself an expert. I was one of the lay people, I would say, in the pool of people who were involved in writing the amendment.
Well, I notice right up front it says every individual, and it doesn't make any delineations on gender or age. Maybe you could talk about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we chose the word individual for a lot of reasons. For one, I want to clarify, because I know there's a lot of, I don't think misinformation is the right word, as lies is a better word out there. This amendment does not change anything related to parental consent. So while it does establish a fundamental right to reproductive freedom, it does not change parental consent laws. So this doesn't, as some advertisements have suggested, say that, a child could go and have an abortion without their parent consenting. That is not going to happen in this amendment. But the word individual is inclusive. It also does apply to both, women and children. I think we all saw that little girl who was raped and impregnated. There was in the news last summer, the 10-year-old who had to go to Indiana to have an abortion. I wouldn't refer to a 10-year-old as a woman. I think we're having something that applies to all people, regardless of age or gender identification, is just something that makes more sense to me as a physician. So individual to us just means really anybody that this could apply to. It would establish that fundamental right.
Does this have any impact on parental rights for patients who are not yet adults?
It does not.
Okay, thanks. And why did your organization choose viability as a milestone for abortion?
So when we wrote this, we really wanted it to make clinical sense, and so this is basically very similar to what we are currently practicing under in the state of Ohio right now. We are functioning under the pre-Dobbs, basically Roe era law, thanks to Jesse Hill and the ACLU's attorneys who put argued for the stay against the heartbeat ban. But, so fetal viability is, as is stated here, is a concept where, there's a point at which a fetus can survive outside of the pregnant person. And that is different in every pregnancy. There's not a day or a specific week of gestation at which a fetus is suddenly viable. It depends on a lot of factors, including the health of the pregnancy, the health of the fetus, and it's also something that can change with time. Right now, typically a fetus might be considered viable at around 23 or so weeks, but that is actually something that's getting a little bit lower as we're as far as gestational age, as we're moving forward in medical care, and it's also something that might differ depending on what type of a hospital you are delivering at. So a baby born at 22 weeks at Mac House, Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital might be considered viable, whereas a a baby born at 22 weeks out in rural America, says my daughter here, might not. And so by using the term viability, we're able to have a word that makes sense, where each physician who is caring for the pregnant woman will be able to determine if a pregnancy actually is viable based on all of the information that person has in front of them.
Yeah, according to statistics, at what stage during a pregnancy do most people have an abortion?
The vast majority of abortions occur early on, typically in the first trimester. It is extremely rare for abortions to occur later on and closer to that point of viability. So vast majority are in the first trimester.
And I'm sorry, you talked about the language coming from other states, but I was wondering, Roe v. Wade was in 1973, and Roe v. Wade also emphasized viability. Has the definition of viability changed at all since Roe v. Wade?
I can't speak to that with certainty, but I think that the concept of viability probably hasn't changed, but our ability to keep a premature infant alive and live a healthy life has certainly changed. In the 70s, a baby that was born at 32, 34 weeks was considered early, whereas now a baby that's born at 30 weeks really isn't. 32, 34 weeks is really not that early. So science and technology has changed, but I think that the concept has probably stayed the same, but I'm not an expert in that area.
Okay, thanks. Now, you referenced a lawsuit in Ohio. Could you talk, please, about how this amendment would change the current status of abortion in Ohio?
Yeah. And so you're referring to the heartbeat ban, I'm assuming. So this law would put into place this notion of a fundamental right to reproductive freedom. And as far as whether or not overnight that heartbeat ban would go away, that I'm not an expert in that area. Jesse Hill and Don McTighe, who are the kind of lead attorneys working with us, will be able to answer that question better. But any arguments in the court made subsequently after this amendment is adopted would be referencing this amendment. And so one could argue that heartbeat ban is unconstitutional once this is in the Constitution.
Yeah, my information is that the original injunction against the heartbeat bill was issued in Hamilton County last summer, and it's currently being appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court. So there could be some delay, I guess, between the Ohio Supreme Court deciding and a vote by the citizens. Mm-hmm. Lauren, what's the process for a citizen initiative to be approved for a ballot in Ohio?
Yes, so it is a huge and long and expensive, unfortunately, undertaking. You start out by writing an amendment. The process of writing this amendment took several months. And then once the amendment is written, then you have to collect 1,000 signatures to be able to submit that amendment to the Attorney General's office. When we did that, we collected actually 7,000 signatures in 48 hours, which was record breaking. So that was pretty exciting. But you submit your language along with 1,000 signatures to the Attorney General's office. And then it's the amendment along with a summary of the amendment that is just a little bit shorter. And the Attorney General's job is to state that the summary is a fair and truthful representation of the amendment. And so then after that happens and that approval is granted, which did happen for us, thankfully, then it goes on to the ballot board. And the ballot board then has to determine whether or not the amendment covers one or more than one issue. And so we spent a lot of time on this amendment for a lot of reasons. And one of the things that we focused on was making sure that this only covered one issue. And that's actually one of the reasons why we are certain that this doesn't address anything related to parental consent, because that would have made it 2 issues. But once the ballot board gives their approval that yes, this is one issue, which the ballot board did unanimously approve, then it goes forward into the signature collection phase. And so that's the phase that we're in right now with this amendment. And in order to, so the number of signatures that are required to be able to then submit that amendment again to the Secretary of State's office for consideration for the general election ballot in November, you have to collect a number of signatures that's equal to 10% of the total voter turnout for the most recent gubernatorial race. And those signatures have to come from 44 of the 88 counties. And within each of those 44 counties, that number within each county has to equal 5% or be greater than 5% of the gubernatorial turnout in that county. And so for us, that means that we need a minimum of 413,000 and some signatures. And the signatures are all collected on paper petitions with pen signatures. It's done in a very organized fashion, and we're getting many more for this. We're getting many more because those signatures have to be from registered voters in the state of Ohio, and there's always issues when they're then certified by or validated by the Secretary of State's office. So it's good to collect many more than you need and many more counties than you need. And then they go to the Secretary of State's office. And then the Secretary of State counts those signatures, make sure that you have above the threshold. And then the ballot board actually writes a summary of their own summary of the language, and that is what actually goes on to the ballot that the voters read in November when they go to the polls. So another reason that we had to be airtight in our language is because we wanted to make sure that it was not going to be misrepresented. And then once it goes to the ballot, then the voters can vote. And currently there's a simple majority requirement. So now in order for a constitutional amendment to pass, it needs 51% of the vote, which is of course being discussed publicly.
Right, right. We'll come back to that. I understand that you have a deadline in July for turning in the signatures to the Secretary of State. And right now, if the signatures are not, if you have an insufficient number of signatures or valid signatures, there is some kind of cure period. Maybe you could talk about the deadlines.
Yeah, so right now we have to have all of our signatures in by July 5th. We're aiming for a couple weeks before that. And then the Secretary of State's office goes through and validates them. And if we were below that minimum requirement of 413,000, then there's, I think it's 20 days where you can go back and kind of frantically collect any additional signatures needed to try to get back up above that minimum requirement and then resubmit. So that's one thing relating to the deadline. And another topic related to the deadline is that if for whatever reason, you didn't get enough signatures to even be able to submit by July 5th, then the signatures that you do collect are evergreen. So if you don't submit it, you can hold on to those signatures and then submit again the following year or the year after that. The only downside of that is that some of those signatures will no longer be valid because people will move or they pass away or, all these things, but you can use the same signatures and just collect more than you need.
Okay. We see that Protect Choice Ohio is running the petition process, and I wonder if you could explain the difference between that organization and Ohio Physicians for Reproductive Rights.
Yeah. So Ohio Physicians for Reproductive Rights is an organization that Marcella Azevedo and I started back the week after the Dobbs decision last summer. We actually started out of this sounds corny, but out of a women doctor Facebook group where I went on there and basically started expressing my concern as to what was going on. And I wrote a draft of a letter that I was going to use to send to my representatives, because I thought, well, if you're upset, if I'm angry, I need to make a change. What am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to reach out to my Congress people. And so I wrote something and I shared it in that doctor's Facebook group, and Marcella saw it and said, hey, this is pretty great. Why don't we turn this into something more substantial? So we started turning that into a letter, and that was the letter that ended up being becoming signed by over 1,000 doctors within 4.5 days, which we were not expecting. And so we took that and we turned those people who had all joined this Facebook group together, and we had started to collect information on everybody who was signing. We turned that into an organization that is called Ohio Physicians for Reproductive Rights. And originally, when we first started, we'd been focusing on advocacy, helping physicians connect to each other during this time of crisis, where we were trying to figure out how to practice medicine in post-Roe Ohio, where we didn't know, me as a general pediatrician, I didn't know if I was going to be, what I was going to be seeing in my office now that abortion was essentially illegal after 6 weeks. It was a very stressful time, and we did a lot of things around education. And then as we started learning about the ballot initiatives that were happening in other states, like in Michigan, and we saw this incredible turnout against that ballot initiative in Kansas, we realized that, hey, we need to do the same thing in Ohio. So then we formed a coalition called Protect Choice Ohio, because, us being a group of physicians, that's what we are. We're physicians. We are not legal experts. We're not political strategists. This is not our area, but we had been making a lot of friends along the way. Also, we are just one group, but we recognize that this effort of getting something on the ballot is pure grassroots democracy in action, and it requires people from groups all over the state, and we all need to band together in order to get this done. And so Protect Choice Ohio is a means to band groups together, gain even more power in numbers, and get volunteers, coordinated boots on the ground, communicating messages, get voters out, and all of that. And so that's what Protect Choice Ohio is. It's this coalition that we formed. And then Ohioans for Reproductive Freedom was forming around the same time that we were. Ohioans for Reproductive Freedom is a coalition of established, powerful reproductive rights and justice organizations. And so their coalition and our coalition came together and formed another entity called Ohioans United for Reproductive Rights. And that's and we submitted the language to the Attorney General's office together as Ohioans United for Reproductive Rights.
All right. Are either of those organizations going to pre-validate the signatures before they get to the Ohio Attorney General?
Yes. So the signature collection effort involves a combination of volunteer collected signatures, but we've also hired a signature collection firm that's helping us get signatures as well. And that signature collection firm will be validating all of the signatures, both that they collected as well as that the volunteers collected. And then we've also hired an additional verification entity as well, who then double checks everything.
Sounds pretty thorough. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you think most Ohioans think about allowing abortion as a choice?
Great question. So there have been polls relating to this over the last several months, and when polled, Ohioans have, I think it's either, it kind of ranges between 59 and 63 or so % of Ohioans support a constitutional amendment that grants a right to reproductive freedom in the state. And so the majority of Ohioans do support some degree of access to abortion in the state. I think it's an interesting statistic that only 6% of Ohioans think that abortion should be entirely illegal, which is a very small minority. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that part of the national controversy now is access to medications that can induce abortion without surgery. Does the proposed amendment affect that debate?
That's a good question. So the proposed amendment protects the right to access abortions, including medical abortions that would require that usually the vast majority, like 98%, involve use of mifepristone, which is the drug that is being getting a lot of attention. And I would actually have to reach out to our attorneys to find out if the Supreme Court did not end up supporting access to mifepristone, exactly what does that mean for the state of Ohio? That I would have to get back to you on, because I actually am not 100% sure about that.
Okay, you're a pediatrician. How does this legal issue affect your patients?
Great question. So yes, as a general pediatrician, I didn't see myself being somebody who would be leading a reproductive rights organization, but the Monday after the Dobbs decision, when I went to work and I really realized that, wow, abortion really is illegal after 6 weeks in Ohio, I had 2 conversations that made me realize that this is going to be a true medical crisis, not just for adult women, but for children as well. And so the first was that I had a mom of one of my 13-year-old patients who's not sexually active called my office and asked if we should put her 13-year-old daughter on birth control, because if she were raped, she might not be able to get an abortion. And I was not prepared for that question. That is not something anybody had ever asked me before. And I knew at that moment, though, that this was not good. Because unfortunately, the bad things happen. And we saw that, I think, the following week with that 10-year-old girl who had to go to Indianapolis. And I think of note, it's important, although it's hard to hear, but that week there was actually a 10-year-old girl and 2 11-year-old girls who were all in the same situation, and they all had to go to Indiana. Only that one 10-year-old got media attention. But in 2021, there were 52 girls under the age of 15, so 14 and under, who all had abortions that were documented in the state of Ohio, which is about 1 per week. So, bad things happen to children and we need to be able to help them. And access to abortion is essential. So that's one horrible but real reality. And then the other is, my teenage patients are high risk in so many ways. And so I have that same morning when I went to work that Monday after the Dobbs decision, I had to call one of my patients that I had been talking to the previous week, who was pregnant. She's a 16-year-old African-American girl from Cleveland Heights, and she was 8 weeks pregnant, and she was trying to decide if she was going to have an abortion or keep her pregnancy. And the previous week, I had helped her make sure she had all of the information that she needed to make the decision that was right for her. And she had gone to preterm, had her initial consultation, and then she was scheduled to see OB/GYN in about 1 to 2 weeks, which is pretty typical for a pregnancy to see an OB/GYN at about 10 weeks is usually the first appointment. And I had to call her and say, hey, if you want to have a termination, you're going to have to go back to preterm today, and it might already be too late. And I had never found myself telling a patient that they should not speak to an expert about their situation. So in this case, telling her that she should not wait to talk to OB/GYN to try to decide what to do. And also, I was talking to her from my Solon office, where I'm surrounded by kids that have a lot of privilege. And I was speaking to a girl who came from a wonderful community in Cleveland Heights, but it is not a community with a lot of means. And I was just couldn't I felt so sad thinking about how if she decided that she wanted to have a termination, that was going to have such an incredible stress on her community, that I'm sure would do everything they could to support her, but it would not create the same stressors for my other patients. And I could just see these disparities in healthcare widening that already are present. And I couldn't sit with that either. So, those were my two, that Monday morning, two patient experiences that really, hit it home. And I think one other area of pediatrics that we don't talk about enough is that there are a lot of pregnancies that involve fetuses that have very complex congenital malformations that are often not carried to term. And a lot of these laws, for example, the heartbeat ban would make it illegal to have a termination of a pregnancy when the fetus is known to likely not survive outside of the pregnant person once born, which is inhumane for both the person, the woman carrying the pregnancy, and also I argue for that fetus, because if a baby's born without lungs and they're born into the world to die, that to me seems horrific. All of these reasons make it really a pediatric crisis, not to mention the fact that, our NICUs are already stretched thin. The neonatal ICUs, we already have a hard time caring for the babies that are born prematurely. And if we have a number of babies that are born that are going to require a lot of medical care, high-level medical care, even if it's just palliative care, that's going to make it hard to take care of the healthy preemie babies that were just born a few weeks early. So, it's really a wide range of crisis in the pediatric world that I am trying to avoid.
Were you surprised by the number of different specialties who responded to your concerns? And maybe you could talk about some of those other specialties. I'll just let the audience know that Lauren filled in at the very last minute for another person who was lined up to speak tonight, who's a dermatologist. And maybe you could talk about why a dermatologist would care on this issue.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And Aziza wishes she could be here, but she got this, whatever stomach bug's going around. Oh gosh. Well, so in those, this whole experience has been absolutely so powerful. And when I first posted, I mentioned that this started with me complaining on Facebook. I felt frustrated and alone. And and then Marcella Azevedo, who, came, the universe brought her, I think, to me to tell, that we could do something together. We started writing this letter, and, we thought, oh, maybe we'll get 10 doctors or, 20 to sign it and print it in the plain dealer. And we never in a million years would have guessed that 1,000 doctors from around the state would be asking to join our group to sign this. And as we were, we had to verify that everybody who was joining our Facebook group was a physician. So we had to look them up, find out what kind of doctor they were, and then, make sure that what they were telling us was correct. And it was absolutely unbelievable to see that there were men and women across the state, all types of medical specialties and surgical specialties, who were all appalled. And it was so clear that, every doctor in the state of Ohio had a week that was similar to my Monday morning, where I had those horrible conversations. And I think a lot of doctors didn't really realize just how much this not having access to comprehensive reproductive medical care impacts their work and their patients. And, for Aziza Wabi, who's a dermatologist, a lot of the medications that she prescribes are known to be terrible if you are on those medications and are pregnant. So it's very important that a lot of her patients have very solid contraception plans. And for patients on something like Accutane, if you became pregnant while on Accutane before all of this, the recommendation from the drug company was actually that you have a termination. They had to change the language after Roe v. Wade because that was no longer something that they could just write as the recommendation anymore. But when a person becomes pregnant on Accutane, it is a total disaster. So, for her, it was very stressful. And it affects all of us. Emergency medicine physicians had a true crisis on their hands because women were coming to the emergency room in a state of crisis after having miscarriages and not being able to get the medical care that they need. And so it impacts us all. And it also impacts, like, I'm a woman of reproductive age. I'm 38 and I'm afraid to get pregnant in the state of Ohio, knowing all of this. And it also impacts our, keeping our doctors in the state. A lot of us are involved in residency training programs. I'm a clinical instructor through where I work. And we have been hearing from medical students and residents, or had been hearing from medical students, that many of them did not plan on staying in Ohio to train because of both the impacts for their training, but also, their own family planning and being afraid to start a family in a state like Ohio that's going through this. And then we ended up seeing that in the actual outcomes of residency matches, where the OBGYN and emergency medicine residency spots were less desirable in states that were going through situations like we are in Ohio. So, now it makes sense that doctors from all specialties were deeply impacted by this, but at the time it was really, we were floored, and we knew that something big needed to happen.
Is there a broader implication with regard to patient privacy and the sanctity of the physician-patient relationship?
Yeah, for me, there's so many problems with what is going on right now with regard to regulating healthcare, reproductive healthcare, and separate from just the fact that this is going to be harmful for people, is that this sets a really bad precedent, that if the state government can regulate these details of medical care and make evidence-based standards of care illegal, and can criminalize physicians and patients for pursuing medical care, what else could that apply to? So I think that by doing this, by defending the reproductive freedom of Ohioans, we're also making a statement about how, medical decisions are something that should be made between a patient and their doctor, and the state government, the government should really, and politicians and lobbyists, it's not their business.
Okay, I actually had a lot more questions on my outline, but we're getting a number of questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn to some of those now. Does the amendment have anything to do with transgender issues? This is coming up during signature collection.
That's a great question. No, it does not. So the amendment, so those advertisements are just straight lies. I think it's the Center for Christian Values and Ohio Right to Life. They know that Ohio is a pro-choice state. They know that this amendment is going to pass once it gets to the ballot. And they know that they don't have a winning issue, so they're just lying. And they have a lot of money, so they can, and freedom of speech is pretty powerful, so they can say what they want. But no, it doesn't. Reproductive freedom in reproductive health care is different than gender affirming care. So, it's not the same thing.
Okay, thanks. Couple questions about signatures. How many signatures have you collected so far? Do you know?
So that's a good question. I do not have a good answer for that, unfortunately. We are actually, so I mentioned that the signature collection firm is doing our counts, and I think yesterday, just sent a whole bunch to them. And we also are doing a huge effort to get the signature collection packets turned back in. There's something like 7,000 packets out there. So if anybody by chance has any, please turn them in. They don't have to be completed. Even if you only have a couple signatures in a packet, we'll give you new packets. But right now we're doing a big overhaul. But we are on track to be successful, but I cannot report a specific number, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. word on the street, somebody heard that 1 of 5 signatures on the initial petition drive, the one to get the language before the Secretary of State, were not valid. Is that correct? And is that normal?
Probably. Typically, one of the reasons that we're aiming for 700,000 signatures when we only need 413,000 is because for a variety of reasons, some of the signatures are truly not valid. It's usually the case of people thinking that they're registered to vote in one county and actually being registered in another, or moving, or they wrote something wrong incorrectly. We're trying to help everybody as best as we can to make sure that they are correctly registered to vote before signing, but it doesn't always happen. And historically, when people would do these signature collection drives, I think it was like 2/3 a validity rate of about 2/3, like 66 to 70% was considered like pretty good, I think, which is one of the reasons why we're going for almost double. So actually, the 1 in 5 being an 80% validity rate, I think is actually correct for that first 1,000, actually 7,000 signatures that we submitted. And that actually is a really high, it's an exceptional, incredibly good validity rate. So my spin on that yes, it was about 80%, and that's awesome. And that's because we have such great volunteers who are out there collecting signatures and are doing a great job.
Okay, here's a medical question.
Okay.
We talked about the Dobbs decision coming down, and then Ohio triggering a law that had passed, I think, in 2017, 2019, that took away the reproductive choice right at 6 weeks pregnancy. That was called the Fetal Heartbeat Bill. Somebody asked, isn't this being challenged? Why isn't it being challenged, since it's a false premise? So I think we need to talk to you about the heartbeat issue.
So what was this? Can you say the last part of your...
Why isn't the Fetal Heartbeat Bill being challenged, since it is a false premise?
That's a great question, because it is ridiculous. I don't know. It might be, I'm not sure. That's definitely not, as far as the legal challenges of that and whether or not that has come up, I don't know. But it's silly, because as I'm sure this person knows, who asked that question, there really isn't a heartbeat at 6 weeks. It's really just electrical activity in these cells that will become, I think it's the AV node in the heart. There is no formed heart, but it's all nonsense and not based in science. So I agree. It should be challenged. And we're kind of doing that through this, establishing a fundamental right to reproductive freedom, but in itself, it's a ridiculous concept.
Are there other ways in which your profession understands pregnancy, as opposed to language and, language of the anti-choice group, and also decisions by the legislators?
Do you mean, say that one more time? Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I was freelancing there.
Sure, it's fine.
Are there other ways in which medical definitions differ from the language used by the anti-choice organizations or by the legislators who are restricting reproductive choice?
So I think that the fundamental issue here is that the people who are trying to regulate this are people who don't actually take care of patients, and aren't actually, they're not the OBGYNs, they're not the maternal fetal medicine physicians who are taking care of, pregnant women with complicated pregnancies. They're not the genetic specialist, ultrasound, radiology, just these people who spend their entire careers understanding fetal development and a healthy or a not healthy pregnancy. And so, I think people try to use a lot of language that it's hard to kind of exactly specify what they say when they say it. But when you read things like the heartbeat ban, it was very clearly not written by a physician. And just in for example, when they say that I think in the heartbeat ban, it referred to times when a woman's health would be in danger enough that she might be able to have a termination. The examples of medical conditions that they provided were actually many of which are actually not unsafe for pregnancies. For example, multiple sclerosis was listed there, which is not really a counterindication to being pregnant. You know, just something that, you know, things that like clearly this person who wrote this is not a physician, is not an OBGYN. And not to say that I'm an expert in these areas at all, but you know, when I read something, I can usually tell if somebody wrote it who is not a medical professional. And so for and as far as specifically language, you know, I've become conscious of words that I choose with regard to how I describe a pregnancy. You know, our idea of like a baby versus a fetus versus an embryo versus a pregnancy. These are all words that unfortunately have emotional responses for people and are when used in different contexts. And so, you know, the anti-choice forces will refer to preborn children and all of these words that just make no sense when you're actually, you know, thinking about what's really going on in this pregnancy. And it's all for an emotional reaction and to make people scared and to think how they're thinking. My long rambling answer to that is yes, there's absolutely differences. And I think it's just good to kind of be sort of, you know, listening for how we all talk about things differently, because it's definitely different.
Lauren, someone told me that 1 in 7 couples seeking to become pregnant, seeking to start a family, end up trying in vitro fertilization. Could you talk about how, with the heartbeat bill and the laws in Ohio, affect that situation?
Yeah. So that's a big topic that's very important because a lot of people struggle with infertility, and that can be really devastating and stressful, very stressful for people. And the whole IVF issue comes under fire, in particular when we discuss the personhood bill. And so in Ohio, the personhood bill has not been adopted, but it easily could be. And the personhood bill defines life as beginning when sperm meets egg. And when you know, you have a uterus and you have sperm and the egg, they meet in the fallopian tube, and then they form a single-celled organism that then multiplies, adheres to the uterine lining. Lots of amazing things happen. And then over time that turns into the fetus, right? But if you are arguing that when sperm meets egg, that single cell is a human with full protection under the law, and anything that would stop that cell from surviving, which is what the personhood bill would do, is basically akin to murder, is that would have a lot of implications for a lot of things, including IVF. And because when people have in vitro fertilization, they outside of the couple will inseminate the egg. So in basically like a petri dish, they have the egg and they put the sperm, and then the sperm inseminates the egg, and then they have an embryo, and then the embryo is put back into the uterus. But you usually do that with about 8 different eggs or so, knowing that some of them will not be viable. They'll have genetic defects or that are kind of very problematic, or they just won't take. And so when people are doing IVF, they'll have these extra embryos. And so then the question is, well, what do you do with these extra embryos? And so I've had, because if you can't just discard them, if they have full protection under the law. So I actually have had patients who have been moving their embryos out of state because they don't want to deal with this. I actually had a patient who was born via in vitro fertilization, and they had kept their embryos out of state for this reason. I have a patient who's has her embryos in the state, but one of the embryos is identified as having complex and basically most likely not viable, or genetic issues that would make this, if this embryo were selected, not survive. So she's wondering, well, what am I going to do with this? What am I supposed to put all of these embryos back in me? So anyway, that's where IVF becomes a kind of a nightmare when you're living under this potential personhood ban. The personhood ban would also make IUDs illegal because IUDs work by stopping implantation of the embryo. So sperm meets egg in the fallopian tube, and then the IUD makes it so that they don't implant. So anyway, that is I really hope we don't get to that point, but that is a real thing that people some people support.
Does the amendment affect IVF or the other situation?
Yes. Yes. So our amendment, the amendment that many of you here are collecting signatures on, thank you, does protect everything relating to reproductive freedom, which includes contraception, IVF, and miscarriage management, and abortions. So, okay. And then other things relating to that as well.
And it sounds like a tremendous effort. What is the cost? Where and how are you being funded?
Yeah, so it is so unbelievably expensive. The cost of democracy is much greater than I'm learning so much. But so in total, it's going to cost probably at least $35 million. The first round of this, where we were writing the language, had multiple attorneys involved. That whole process, the initial process costs about $350,000 for several months' work. The signature effort that we're doing right now, collecting the signatures, we're expecting will cost at least $6 million. However, some people are anticipating it might be even more than that, up to $10 million, because it's expensive. It's huge. It's a lot of paper. It's hiring people to organize volunteers, and then also hiring the signature collection firm that's helping us is extremely expensive. And then the very expensive part of this is going to be the campaign that will start once we've turned in all those signatures to the Secretary of State's office, and then it becomes like a full-blown, like a political campaign. And that we're anticipating will probably cost around $30 million. And you can see the power of money in the anti-choice forces who have already been spending millions of dollars on advertisements that are filled with lies. So we are, who knows how expensive this will really get because of the what seems like almost limitless resources that we're up against. But thankfully we have, public opinion on our side. We know that this is Ohio is a pro-choice state, and we have people working together from all sides of the political aisle on this, which is very helpful because this really, in our perspective as physicians, is a human rights issue. It's not a political issue. It's unfortunately been politicized, but we have a lot of people who are working together to get this done.
Thank you. I think we've covered all the questions from the audience, and I do want to return to one thing you mentioned. The constitutional amendment process right now is a process that's been in action since, I think, 1920, around then. And there is a possibility that the Ohio legislature will vote next week to change that situation by creating a special August election that would change the rules for citizen initiatives turning into constitutional amendments. And I want our viewers to know that the League of Women Voters is opposed to that possibility, to that proposed legislation. It's called HJR1/SJR2. The League is advocating against it based on its high cost, about $20 million. The the likelihood of low turnout, since August elections typically get about 8% of voters turning out, and because the Ohio legislature just in the last year, in 2022, eliminated August primaries for those reasons, as well as the fact that these laws that law proposal would be an attempt to change the rules mid-game and suppress citizen initiatives. We have a couple minutes for closing remarks if you'd like to say anything, Lauren.
Yes, I would love. So I feel I agree completely with opposing that. And I was reading about, I've been learning about the history of these citizen-initiated ballot efforts. And I think it was in 1912, the Ohio Constitutional Convention. There's an interesting article, I'll see if I can find it and send it to you, where they talked about how Teddy Roosevelt actually came to Ohio and declared his support for citizen-initiated ballot measures as being something that this people of Ohio would adopt. And that was that effort to create this process was done in response to that period of time in American history when corporations and monopolies and all of this huge money had so much control over what was going on in the government. And so the citizen-initiated ballot measures were created to give some power back to the people. And so these efforts now that our state government is undertaking, or where our elected officials are trying to take away power from the people, to put it back, to put more power really back into the government, is just opposite of the spirit of the history of these measures. And their arguments that, so one of the arguments is that it's, to protect the Constitution from special interests. And that's all lies, because if you can see, this is an extremely challenging and expensive process. And so if by making it harder, no citizen-led initiative is going to be able to, it's almost impossible for citizen-led initiatives to make it onto the ballot. And if you make it harder, only those forces that have unlimited resources will be able to do that, which is the whole point of the opposite of why these are supposed to be there. So, I think for me, just kind of my closing thoughts are that, I feel like this is again, it's true grassroots democracy. We are using our voice, and we're doing the right thing by giving the people the rights to decide, not only have the choice. Obviously, I support people having the choice to have their own, reproductive healthcare decisions, but by putting this on the ballot, we're letting the people make the choice about the law. And that, I think, is a really beautiful concept. And I am honored to be part of it. And I'm honored to be speaking with you all here. The League of Women Voters is just such a wonderful organization. I'm a member, and I have so much respect for everything that you do. And we're all in this together.
Thank you. I have a question from an audience member about donating, but I'm going to just point to the QR code in the corner of the screen and say again that the League has not actually endorsed this amendment process, this particular amendment. The League is focused on voter rights and voter access. So thank you. I'm going to send things back to Lynn to close us out this evening.
Yes, thank you. And wow, what a wonderful, powerful presentation. Dr. Beene, you are just amazing. So we want to give you a heartfelt thank you for taking your time and sharing all of your knowledge. Likewise, Annette Sutherland, League of Women Voters Shaker Heights Chapter Chairperson, thank you so much to moderating this webinar. You did an excellent job, as usual. Now, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government. To learn more about the League and to find your local chapter, please visit www.lwvohio.org. To take action, go to LWVGC, that's the Greater Cleveland website, and join the League of Women Voters. Also, talk with your friends, family, neighbors. Engage your legislators over issues that matter to you. Cite facts, be polite. Share the recording of this webinar with others and look for follow-up emails with links to this webinar, as well as how to learn more and take action. This session was recorded and the recording will be posted on the League of Women Voters website. Thank you for attending, and again, good evening.